Hey guys, Chapter 14, Section 3. We're going to wrap it up and talk about land management and conservation. How we manage it and what we're doing to preserve it for future generations. Your essential question: what are the ecological functions of parks and wilderness lands? What are they good for, right? Why do we have them? Going right into this, just land management in general. The main categories of land that we have, mainly we're really talking rural land here, not urban, so we're outside rural areas. The main categories: farmland, rangeland, and forest land. Then we have our national and state parks and wilderness. But honestly, if we're talking about a state park and a wilderness, it's still falling into, for the most part, forest or rangeland. It just depends on what it is, which we'll go into. So those three: farmland, rangeland, and forest. Sometimes we've managed these lands very sustainably, that they're still there and they're there for our future generations, and they provide these resources indefinitely. Also, sometimes we've reduced their productivity tremendously by overusing them and polluting them. Now, these services that we talk about, they're cleaning the CO2 out, they're providing us oxygen, this is where we're getting our fresh water from, it rains, trickles down, all this stuff. So we talk about services, we're talking about things that you and I need for survival. Basically, food, water, oxygen, and cleaning up of CO2. So the condition of rural lands is important because of those ecological services that it provides, honestly, to all of us. Now let's break those down a little further. Farmlands. Farmlands are sometimes called croplands, where we're growing our grains, foods, etc. So farmland is just that, where we're growing crops and fruit. It could be new, once again, anything that we're growing, that we're eating, that's going to be plant-based. The United States contains more than 100 million hectares of prime farmland. Hectare is a metric unit. In America, we tend to talk about acres. A hectare is getting around about 2-point-something acres. However, in some places, the urban development is threatening a lot of our really good farmland, right? We have the city, and then it tends to spread outwards into our urban sprawl, and the suburbs start taking over farmland. Well, in 1996, the government established a national farmland protection program. The idea was state and county local governments, we're trying to protect the farmland. It's very easy. You're a developer and I want to put in a housing project. Well, you just buy out a farm. That's what's right there, and it tends to be flat. It's good, but it's flat. It's good farmland for a reason, and we've got to protect it. If we have to cut down a forest, it's better to cut down a forest and put in neighborhoods than to try and cut down a forest and turn it into farmland. It was a forest and farmland for a reason to begin with. And we've realized we've got to start protecting our farmlands, otherwise they're largely going to be gone as urban sprawl moves into it. Of course, urbanization isn't going to take over every area, but we need to protect this good farmland and keep it for farmland. This takes us to rangeland. Rangeland, now it's supporting different types of vegetations. It could be some grasslands, or what we kind of call shrublands, and even getting into desert, especially like scrub desert. The reality is these are lands that are not good for farming or for timber. It's not getting enough rain to grow trees, and quite often it's really not even getting enough rain for others, or it's getting too much rain, pushing into something like wetlands. These are lands that for whatever reason we can't grow crops or trees, but we can put cattle out on it, if you will. So they can be arid, kind of like the rangelands out in the west, where it's sort of deserty-like, but they're scrub, and the animals can go out and eat here, and they go out on a large range. Or they can be relatively wet, like this one here in Florida. A lot of our rangelands in Florida tend to be wet, so we can really put more cattle. They grow, but we can't, once again, it's too wet for trees, and it's only wet part of the year. We don't want to remove it as being a wetland, but these wind up being good rangeland for our animals. Now, the most common use of rangeland is for grazing livestock, like our cows, if you will. But we do cattle, sheep, goats. Now, these are the most common on all of them. But honestly, people that have horses, they're going to be out on the ranges as well. Cattle, sheep, and goats are prized either for meat, their milk, wool, and we're using the hides for leather, etc. Those are the most common. Now, obviously, native wildlife is out there grazing on these lands as well, whether it's pronghorn sheep out in the west, mountain goats in some of these areas, deer, all kinds of animals are grazing on these rangelands, not necessarily just crop animals. You're even going to have rabbits out there, right? Anything that is a vegetarian or herbivore is going to be out in these rangeland areas. Just like farmland, rangeland is essential for maintaining our world food supply, right? For the most part, we're eating a mixture of plants and animals. So we need areas for the animals to be able to go out and feed. World population growth may require like a 40% increase in the food production between just drawing a line in the sand from 1977 to 2030, just 10 years from now, we're looking at close to a 40% increase from then to here. Population growth has been crazy, and it's a hungry world, and we need to feed them. Now, on the rangelands, though, the problems that we tend to run into, we've talked about farming, where we have bad farming practices can lead to salinization of the soil, waterlogging, desertification, and bad things. We can get some of the same type of problems on rangeland. The biggest problem for rangeland is overgrazing. Back to tragedy of the commons, right? It's in my benefit to get as many animals out there as I can. Most of our rangelands, a lot of them are owned by the federal government, and anybody can put their cattle out on it. So overgrazing is just one of the biggest ones. Too many out there, and they're eating all the food. Once the food's gone, it goes into more desert-like conditions. Often it can even change the plant community. So the animals are out to pick on cows. Cows are out there and they eat the desirable plants and grasses, but then they leave the less desirable plants. So since the less desirable plants are the ones left alone, they reproduce more often. So what happens is the land goes from having plants that they eat and plants that they don't eat to having only plants that they don't eat, because those are the ones that are reproducing and propagating, and now the rangeland isn't very useful. And in cases of severe overgrazing, they literally just eat everything. They eat what they want, and they eat what they have to if it's the only food they have, and all the food is gone. Now, once all the food is gone, there's nothing to keep the soil from eroding. And once the soil winds up eroding away, the loss of topsoil, desertification occurs, lots of problems. So, biggest problem is overgrazing. But because most of it is actually public land, it winds up getting degraded. Again, it's my best interest to put as many of my cows out there as I can, and once it's all gone, I sell my cows and I made my money. But then the rangeland is trashed for decades. So we have a Public Rangeland Act of 1978. Same thing, it's enacted to try and reverse this trend. We realize if you just let people do what they want, they quite often will abuse the service. So the idea is we try and limit how many cows can actually be on it. So we go by the farmers that use it. Okay, you could have 50, you could have 50, you could have 50, whatever the case may be. Or you have a larger farm, you get to have 100, whatever it is. So sustaining the productivity of this rangeland typically is just trying to reduce overgrazing, but it's a federal job, if you will, to manage these rangelands. And sometimes we can fence them off, and we're gonna let, so you can over here, and then next month everything has to get transferred, so we let this land sit. Lots of different ways to handle it, but rangelands. Taking us to forest lands. Now, forest lands are the largest of all. Like 30% of all of our land out there is forest land. It's our largest. Now, forest land is going to have the trees. We harvest trees for all kinds of products. Furniture, paper, which we're grinding it up for, building house, lumber for our homes, desks that you might have that we're writing on at school or at home. Anyway, we get the idea. We use trees for lots of things. Lumber and paper, furniture, just to name some of the simple ones. We also get a lot of food products and others like maple syrup. It's literally just the sap from a maple tree. Turpentine, mineral spirits, a lot of things come from tree products that we're kind of like milking a cow. We're milking a tree to get the maple syrup or to get turpentine, other things from them. So there's a lot of use we get out of trees from our forest lands. And there's a lot of ecosystem services that trees obviously provide. Outside of just the lumber we get from having them, the huge one of them scrubbing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Because that's photosynthesis, right? The tree is living by pulling the CO2 out and then producing oxygen. So we desperately need the trees and the plant growth out there providing this economic service. Now when it comes to harvesting trees, people use an enormous amount of wood. The worldwide average, you just go to every person, if we see how much wood we're using, what the average comes out to be, is about 1,800 cubic centimeters of wood per person each day. Yeah, how big is that? Well, cubic centimeter is the same as a milliliter, roughly a 2-liter Coke, okay? It's 1.8, so slightly smaller, but think every day you use a log about the size of a 2-liter Coke, whether it's paper, various things. Think about, you get packages coming from Amazon, etc. Now in the United States, our per person average is 3.5. So people in the United States, this is true of most of the developed world, we're using a lot more. This means people in less developed countries are actually using a lot less. Even though in less developed countries, a lot of them are using firewood to cook or to burn with. But a lot of ours is just waste, whether it's paper, boxes, you order something from Amazon, I go to the store and I buy something and it's wrapped in stuff, but I pull it out and just throw it away. We have a lot of single-use kind of paper stuff, and we're using a lot. So in America, we're using 3.5 logs every day of wood. Now it's taking into account, you bought a desk and you're gonna use the desk for 5 or 6 years. Or you built a house and the house might stand for 20, but we're still trying to take into account everything. So about 1.5 billion people in the world are using wood as firewood. It's what they're cooking with because they don't have electricity, natural gas, etc. So the timber industry kind of looks at these forest lands that we need for getting wood because we're using so much of it, and we put it into 3 main categories. Virgin forest, sometimes known as old growth. These are forests that have never been cut down, and we really try to leave our old growth forest as much as possible. We have what we call native forest. They're planted and managed. We say they're native because it's just the type of trees that tend to grow there is what we replant. But these are where we really go for our lumber. They are managed. We're cutting them down, we're replanting and cycling it all around. And then we just have tree farms. And if you've ever driven towards the beach from here, or probably wherever you might live, anywhere, you'll see where you go by and you see these like rows of trees. Pine trees are incredibly common. And this is just a tree farm. The trees have been planted specifically to harvest later. So the government gives an incentive, say, hey, we will buy the seedlings for you if you'll plant them, and then you can pay to get them harvested later. So people plant tree farms. They're just there, and 15, 20 years later, they'll come by and cut them down, use them for lumber, and they'll replant into trees again. So virgin forests, never been cut. Native forests, we're growing native trees, letting them grow, but we are cutting them out periodically, and tree farms. The 2 most widely used methods to harvest the trees are clear cutting and selective cutting. Now, let's break those down and take a look. Clear cut. You own a sawmill and you want to make money by turning trees into lumber. The most cost-effective way is tree cutting. This is where the trucks pull up to a forest and they cut the trees down, stick them on, go to the next row, and they just cut the entire forest and it's gone. Like the picture back here. This is clear cutting. Very damaging, obviously. We're destroying the habitat for whatever lives there. All the animals that used to live in that forest, there's no forest there anymore. So it's a destruction of habitat. We lose the economic services of everything. The vegetation's all gone, soil can wash away. This is really the worst practice, but it's easier to make money. Selective cutting is another process, and this is much better. This is where we go in and we're only taking out the middle-aged trees. So somebody goes through and marks which trees they're going to cut, and then the lumberjacks come by and they take out the selected trees. We leave the young trees, we leave the really old trees, we just take out the medium ones. So the forest is left intact. You know, we're taking out some trees, there's some damage to the forest, if you will. But overall, the forest is left intact, and this is much better. But it costs more to get the lumber this way. But these are far and away the two most common: clear cutting and selective cutting. Deforestation. Now, selective cutting leads to deforestation, but what happens with deforestation is not even just that. It's as populations expand, the demand for forest product increases and the forests get converted into the land for farmland to make space for roads, homes, factories, offices, etc. When I lived in Nepal, they completely deforested the mountains around Kathmandu. Population expanded, they needed the trees to build the houses, to build the furniture, to build the chairs, to build their desks. They needed the wood for firewood, for cooking, for making paper, and they just cut down all the surrounding trees. So the population expanded and they cut down all the trees for the use, and it was deforested. And a lot of times when lands get deforested, obviously, well, the wildlife habitat changes and gets impacted and there's nothing left. The picture back here is a picture of one in Nepal. Now, what looks like trees behind that guy, they're not. Those things are just little bushes. You can see the one kind of just behind him. That's only like 5-6 feet away. Those aren't trees in the background. The whole thing is everything's just really low lying. And even on that back mountain, the things that look, those are all just little bushes. The trees were all cut down. Some of it's been made into farmland, but a lot of it, they just use the wood and it's become deforested, which leads to soil erosion. Now, some of that you can see the terracing, they're putting terraces in to grow food, but in other areas there's just bad aspects of soil erosion, and then that whole area is not good for a really long time until those things can grow back and soil can recover. So if it's not planted with any kind of cover crop or something, this is where we get the big problem. The rate of deforestation is especially high right now in tropical rainforest. And the real problem is there. What's happening? Farmers are clear cutting the land to grow crops because population is expanding, they need to grow food. But rainforests, as we learn, have really bad soil. It's very thin. So what happens is they go out, they cut it down, kind of like the see picture back here. You see the forest cut out. They grow crops. You can only get crops on it for 3-5 years, and then it just becomes rangeland. All we can do is put cattle out. But the forests don't really recover because the soil's so thin. We've cut out all the trees and the trees don't come back, because in the rainforest, all the nutrients are actually in the trees. They're not in the soil. So it's just incredibly damaging when we cut down the rainforest to try and turn it into croplands, because it doesn't last very long. This takes us to reforestation. So we have deforestation, we have reforestation. There are a lot of efforts out there that are trying to reestablish the development of trees in our forest lands. In the United States, we've done a good bit. Back in the 1920s, we had deforested huge tracts of areas, but a lot of it we managed, we planted, replanted, and forests are coming back. And in some places, the reforestation is happening faster than the trees are cutting down. Costa Rica is another one. It's been a great example of reforestation and kind of reclaiming their forest lands. Because the price of deforestation, soil erosion, leads to landslide, we get flooding, and sometimes these things are the cost of that is much worse than the benefit we got from the lumber. And a lot of countries are realizing this, and they're going with some reforestation, some very specific plans to replant their forests, because the damage of the forest being gone is much greater than the benefit they got from the initial trees. So a lot of governments require reforestation after timber's been harvested from these public lands. You know, the idea is you can cut the trees down, but you have to go back in and plant afterwards. You have to take some of your profits and put the seedlings back in. But 90% of worldwide, not necessarily in the United States, but worldwide, 90% of all lumber is coming from places that aren't managed by anybody. So there's nobody out there monitoring if you're planting back. Nobody is monitoring the health of the forest. They're not doing selective cutting. They're just taking what they need. So a lot of governments are really working very hard to improve these reforestation efforts. And a lot of times it just comes down to there's nobody out there monitoring it, right? We say you're not supposed to do it, but if there's nobody out there with checks and balances and seeing, do you have a permit, do you have a right to cut it down, it creates problems. And this takes us to our parks and preserves. In 1870, a group of explorers came and they approached Congress with news of this magnificent expanse of land out in Wyoming and Montana. And they believed it would wind up getting damaged by development in the same way the forest in the Northeast. Remember, 1776, countries by 100 years later, we've done a lot of deforestation around the East, a lot of development of the cities up and down the coast. And when people were pushing out west, they said, man, we've got to protect this. Other people need to see this amazing resource in the same way we saw it. And Congress agreed to protect this land, and they set aside Yellowstone. Yellowstone National Park was our first national park. Today, the United States has right at about 50 national parks. So these have been set aside as lands that aren't to be destroyed, developed, etc. Now we have our national parks, but we also have what we call wilderness. 1964, the United States Wilderness Act was passed. It designates certain lands as wilderness. Wilderness, this is a region that cannot be cultivated and it cannot be inhabited by humans. Sometimes we have national park, but they're cultivated, we still have this or that, or we allow mining on it. Wilderness area is completely untouched, if you will, by humans. Now you can go camping in wilderness, but there's no sites, there's no electricity, you're just finding an area to set up and go. My wife and I used to go backpacking in the Shining Rock Wilderness area up in North Carolina. It was fantastic. There might be a very rudimentary trail, but once again, you're just setting up and you're camping off to the side. Nothing is provided there. It's just like it's been all the time. Currently in the United States, there's about 474 regions, and it covers about 32 million acres that have been designated as wilderness. It's still not a lot when we talk about the size of the United States, but they're open to hiking, fishing, camping. Once again, you just can't have roads, you can't use motorized vehicles. It is just, as a human, you can go out on it. Some areas are roped off as well, but as a general rule, you go out and enjoy the wilderness areas, but nothing can be built on them. So these protected areas really give us a lot of benefits. They're the only place that we can really see an unspoiled forest. Sometimes they're deserts and even prairies. We've tried to pick all the different types of ecosystems we have and set up wilderness systems in them so you can still go see what they're really like. Because without it, otherwise we tend to develop it, turn it into farmland, cities, something. So they're almost like outdoor classrooms, right? And a lot of scientists go up and they'll set up some lab research where we can still learn about this aspect of our natural world and see how things are functioning out in, quote unquote, the real world instead of just a lab. And not to mention they're providing great places for you and I to go out and do some hiking and be out in really true nature, not on a trail, not on a boardwalk, nothing fenced off, just true nature. Now, threats to these protected areas, and even just our parks, if you will. More and more people are visiting national parks and wilderness area every year. And because of that, the human presence, we do tend to litter, going in and using the parking places and packed in. We've had so many tourists in some of our national parks, it's causing a degradation of some of them there. Our rangelands, a lot of times there's a mining and logging sites along here. The gas operations, pipelines run through things, and they are close enough to the parks to really cause an effect on them sometimes. And a lot of times just these preserved areas are affected by climate change, right? As we're getting less rain, especially up in our Pacific Northwest and along California, climate change has caused it to get drier and drier. And of course, forest fires raging through the area are a huge issue. Also, we just wind up getting water pollution. So I have a wilderness area, but if we're polluting the water up here, it's running down in, and this affects the wildlife and everything that can be there. So climate change, air pollution, water pollution, these things tend to affect everything, not just the area that we're doing it, but national parks and areas that have been set aside ideally for eternity. Now, in attempts to protect these wilderness areas from damage, a lot of times we're setting up limits. We're saying, okay, only so many people can go into the park for a day. So a lot of your national parks, at a certain point, they fill it up. We can't have any more visitors. They only take so many. Some areas are completely closed to visitors, allowing some of the animals to breed, etc. So sometimes for seasons, they'll cut it off, or for times of the day. Once again, trying to allow wilderness to be wilderness. And we have a lot of volunteer programs active in a lot of these different areas. And volunteers go by, they can pick up trash, they help to establish trails, trailhead, help to control invading or exotic species from getting released or in, and really just help to educate the public on how to treat these vast lands. Guys, I hope you take advantage of it. Get out there, get into a national park or a wilderness area, and go see the world as it is. Not always just from a town or exploring on your PlayStation, right? Get out there and see what it's really like. Guys, that's it for land management, land use, what it is. Take care, and we'll see you next time.